on the Symposium Theological Scripture with the theme of creation care. My name is Max Lee. I am the Paul W. Brandel Professor of Biblical Studies, and I welcome you all to the last session. A little bit of a word of disclaimer. I had missed the first day, so I'm catching up, but I'm very glad to be here. I and also Academic Dean, Dr. Hannah Andre, she also sends her greetings, but we both had to teach an intensive course for North Park Monday through Friday, 8 to 5 out in Santa Clara. And I took a flight that landed here around 1:30 in the morning in order to get here to at least make the second day. And Dean Hannah is coming in later today, so she sends her greetings and her apologies that she's not here, but we welcome all of you. It is my pleasure to introduce our paper presenter and our respondent. Alice Hague is a friend of North Park and an alumnus. Alice is an interdisciplinary environmental social scientist based at the James Hutton Institute in Aberdeen, Scotland. She's interested in how and why communities engage with environmental issues and what motivates people to tackle big environmental challenges at the local scale. She has studied faith-based engagement in environmental issues, particularly looking at Christianity and climate change, and the intersection of faith-based environmental action and politics in a Scottish context. She has an MDiv from North Park Theological Seminary here in Chicago, Illinois, and a doctorate from the University of Edinburgh, United Kingdom. Okay. Is it still United? I keep wondering about what's happening in Scotland. Okay. Okay. And
at the moment, yes.
Okay. All right. And our respondent is James Amadon. He is the executive director of Circlewood, an organization focused on accelerating the greeting of faith through creative media, immersive education, and the development of Circlewood Village, an ecological learning center on Camano Island, Washington. I hope it's Camano. Thank you, Camano. I knew I would flub one day, one part. Sorry about that. So Camano Island in Washington. James is ordained in the Covenant Church and has a DMin from Duke Divinity School, where he focused his work on ecological Christian leadership. Could you please welcome both our presenter and our respondent? Alice will be reading from Practicing Hope in a Changing World, Local Churches and Environmental Action.
Thank you. And thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's quite humbling to be invited back to a place where you studied, once you've kind of moved on and done other things. So I really appreciate the invite and the opportunity to share some thoughts. So today I'm talking about the practice of creation care in the church. So what social scientists might call faith-based environmental action or religious environmentalism. And it takes many forms. So we've been talking quite a lot about the biblical and theological foundations over the last couple of days. But one other area of research that's thinking about the practice of creation care is social science, which I suppose is broadly defined as the study of people and society. So social science includes research from a range of disciplines. My own background is politics, but also sociology, anthropology, human geography. And my interest, as Max says, particularly relates to environmental politics and this intersection of kind of religion and politics and environmental issues. And building on what we've been talking about the last couple of days, I'm going to take a slightly different approach and look at the study of people and society in the context of churches and church communities. And so the practice of creation care in the everyday lives of people and congregations. And in this paper, I'm going to argue that caring for creation should be a fundamental part of the everyday practice of the Christian faith, rather than a kind of environmental add-on. And I'm going to show how the practice of creation care in the churches is about the practice of justice, it's about the practice of community, and for me, engaging in creation care thus becomes a practice of hope. So my broad research interests relate to understanding how and why communities engage in environmental issues. Some of this interest stems from my own experience. One of the first books I remember buying was this one. So buying with my own money as a teenager. It's called The Young Person's Guide to Saving the Planet. So I guess I've always felt relatively well informed about some of the environmental challenges facing society today, whether it's things about climate change, whether it's biodiversity, Or more recently, I've been getting into questions about just the massive resource use and how on earth we can change our focus and think about, not using so much and not throwing everything away. So I'm broadly interested in how we transition to a more sustainable way of living. And I find some of the size of these environmental challenges quite overwhelming. And I've had a bit of a diverse career, and I have been in some of the rooms where some of these kind of high-level decisions are discussed. And I always found a slight disconnect between these kind of high-level political discussions and the reality of each of our everyday lives. So through these experiences, I've kind of asked questions about the connections between those international level of politics where the decisions are made that could change the world for the better. And that's where the media attention often focuses. And it's where some of the questions about these global challenges do need to be discussed. But my questions about the connection between that global level and, as I say, the reality of people on the local level, the reality of communities around us all. So the underlying questions of my research are often about why bother, essentially? What's the point of taking action at the local level when there's these great big global challenges above us? And I sometimes feel, we were talking yesterday a little bit, that the everyday actions can sometimes feel both important, but the question of, is it really making a difference? So I'm interested in how and why communities do take action, and just how and why we continue to empower those actions, even though it feels at times that what we really need is a city or the country to, massively invest in renewable energy, or make other major changes. And I'm interested in those interactions between the local level and the kind of the way governments and governance and decision making all interact. So in political science, these three different levels of political decision making are part of what's called multi-level governance. So it's a kind of multiple vertical and also horizontal levels of decision making in any policy area, and the kind of interactions between them. I think in the US, the simplest distinctions would be the kind of international level, so where the US is represented at the UN, the national level, the federal level, the decisions that are made in Washington, and then the kind of the local level, the state or the city, so the level that is closer to the people. Although I say that I understand that's a simplistic overview, but it's just kind of laying it out, because I think it's a useful framework also for thinking about where decisions are made, who's got power to make decisions, and the kind of how change can be achieved in what way. So as I say, at the international level on climate change, for example, the international level is the kind of the UN negotiations about emissions reductions. At the national level, it might be national policies to transition away from fossil fuels or to, say, reach net zero emissions. And then at the local or regional level, it might be a state level plan or a city level plan, which might also include things like community health and reducing air pollution, enhancing air quality. So these kind of multiple levels at which different spheres of influence act. And as I say, I've got these little arrows here. There are, of course, interactions up and down and interactions across and interactions between different cities. And so it's inherently messy, this system, but it's a way to help us just kind of think about how governments work and how decisions are made. But I also think it's interesting because it helps us think about the different levels of action for creation care, and the different ways that churches and denominations can also be spaces for taking action. So I'm aware I'm going to use the language of climate change a lot in this presentation, which reflects a lot of my research context. And up until I got on the plane on Wednesday, there was little conflict in the UK about climate change, but I understand we're changing our minds on that now. But I also recognize that in some contexts, talking about climate change is a challenge. And despite the fact that the surveys show that most adults in America are concerned about climate change, I recognize that's not the case in everyone's context. And for many people, talking about climate change might just be a turn off for some people. And I know climate scientist and evangelical and Christian Catherine Hayhoe often argues that the simplest and most direct thing people can do about climate change is just to talk about it. So I'm going to do that, but if it's a block for you, I encourage you just to kind of think about other terms such as environmental protection, environmental justice, the broader context of nature protection, things we've been talking about over the past few days, and that might also be more of an inroad into the community that you may work with. So at the international level, a lot of social science research talks about how faith-based actors, about how churches, about how other organizations kind of engage at the international level in things like how faith-based actors partake in some of the UN negotiations, often working alongside other third sector organizations, part of the kind of civil society presence at the international negotiations. And there's been some research done that's shown how on the international stage, a lot of faith-based actors will draw on moral and ethical reasons in their kind of statements about why change should be made, why action should be taken, on concepts of climate justice. And research shows that, say, the faith-based actors often work with other members of civil society. And it's not that they necessarily have a distinct voice, they don't necessarily speak differently, but they do add a different moral dimension, and they kind of bring a different demographic into the conversations. And so they join alongside civil society and often, support calls for justice and climate justice. What research also shows is that faith-based actors generally adopt a kind of less technocratic approach. And we were talking yesterday a little bit about some of the technological aspects of change and actually how maybe there's meaning in wider things as well. And so it's, and also that faith-based actors often are less confrontational and more part of the system, more mediatory in kind of being part of the negotiations. I also do think it's important to say that faith-based actors, so their presence in the international arena isn't necessarily without tension. And indeed, faith-based actors don't necessarily support what we would say kind of, are not always necessarily progressive on climate action. So while I'm talking from a perspective today about organizations and churches that are engaging in climate action, it's also important to note that there are faith-based actors who are part of the kind of the voice against climate action at the international level as well. So another example from the international level was the encyclical, the Pope's encyclical Laudato Si, or On Care for Our Common Home, which is a kind of, an encyclical is an occasional document within the Catholic social teaching. And this one, released in 2015, was the first to really go into discussion of environmental issues, the kind of key social issues of the time, addressing things like tackling pollution and waste in the throwaway culture. And a key message presented in this was about the interconnectedness of all things. And again, the kind of the working with non-human nature as well, and a call for an integral ecology that really takes this interconnectedness of all things seriously. But what was clear at the time, and I think possibly has since been forgotten, is that the encyclical was released about 6 months prior to some quite major UN climate negotiations. And there was a lot of media coverage at the time. So while it might be a document that is, I say, forms part of Catholic social teaching and feeds into the, the kind of practice of the church, it was also a very high-level political statement to be released and to kind of speak to leaders of different countries about, come on, we've got these climate negotiations. There's reasons for where you're coming from to be progressive on taking action. So just to kind of then go down to the next level, thinking about national engagement, research attention often looks at the kind of words of church leaders, maybe representative organizations, denominational statements, and how faith actors in different countries are engaging in their own political contexts. Evan Berry, a sociologist at Arizona State University, has recently drawn together a collection of case studies about the intersection of religion and climate politics in different national contexts, and making sure to include examples from beyond the global north. So about how religious environmentalism is taking action in the Philippines and the Caribbean, and Peru and India and things, to really try and make this actually more of a global discussion than a global north discussion. And in that kind of context, I've got up here, justice, stewardship, creation care. There's a lot of work on poverty and inequality, a lot of calls about the impact of climate change on vulnerable communities. And often at the national level, the research shows the context becomes very important to the work. So the Church of Bangladesh is going to be involved in different levels of action, different types of actions and different reasons than the Church of Scotland, for example. And so research has shown that also at the national level, churches and denominations are often part of campaigns to divest investment funds. So churches hold their investment funds, and churches in Europe particularly are divesting their investment funds from fossil fuels, drawing on principles of justice and equity, and just emphasizing the kind of disinvestment from fossil fuels is a morally right thing to do, just as often churches and faith-based groups wouldn't invest in gambling or tobacco and things like that. So it's kind of part of this thinking about how we manage our whole business, our whole organization. And then a more recent study, just to draw attention to, by Robin Globus-Veldman, who did some research about how and why evangelicals in the US are actually the most skeptical major religious group about climate change. And again, just picking up on the intersection of politics and religion, and how sometimes that can actually prevent rather than support taking action on climate change at the national level. So at the national level, I say the research shows justice is often a theme adopted in statements and when people are explaining their reasons for engaging. But there's also some indication of the realities of church life, so leadership, resources, and just how these connections between religion and politics can hinder engagement or promote engagement. And I think one of the challenges sometimes is that despite what might be said in a denominational statement or by church leaders, research often shows that churchgoers often kind of feel that their local level experience is detached from the denominational level experience and the denominational statements. And so for me, that's why it's important to think about actually the practice at the local level and to understand the big picture of how creation care is practiced. So thinking at the local level, we come to the context which is closest to the everyday experiences of most people. In politics, this might be the local government, the city government, but in terms of church and faith-based actors, I'm also thinking of the congregation. So this is level that most people experience what sociologist Nancy Ammerman calls everyday religion. Others use the term lived religion or religion on the ground. The everyday experience of people engaged in environmental activity in their faith communities. A number of studies have investigated the local level. So many of these again are from North America, but increasingly studies from different contexts around the world. From North America, Sybil Shattuck, she studied 15 congregations from multiple faiths in the Midwest, and again talked about this kind of the importance of the local context for deciding what actions to take, and kind of different champions, the kind of different people in the churches, the different leaders, the different congregations, the different partnership organizations around. These all have an influence on whether sustainability becomes embedded in the life of a church or whether it kind of falls by the wayside. Others might be interested in Amanda Boss' work. She did some work in Chicago with a group I think called Faith in Place. But it's important because it looks at how theology and environmental actions intersect in much more diverse communities than many of the studies have done so far. And Amanda Baugh is kind of working to address an appropriate critique of much of the work in religious environmentalism, that it's a fairly white middle-class sphere. Another study investigating the Catholic Church in the Syracuse area, a few years after Laudato Si came out, identified some of the barriers that church leaders talked about as their reasons for engaging or for not engaging. And these included the kind of individual level barriers. Church leaders maybe talked about a lack of knowledge and so didn't feel confident preaching on environmental topics, lack of interest in environmental topics, a focus on other priorities. And in some cases, there was a sense that environmental issues are concerns for rural churches rather than urban churches. And I think we've done well this weekend, or these last couple of days, kind of pushing back against that narrative. And of course, the reality of a lack of time for leaders to be doing everything. And at the structural level, some of the barriers that were identified in that Syracuse area were kind of lack of senior support, lack of others around who were interested in the issues, concern about perceptions or polarization in the pews, even just by mentioning environmental issues. And then, of course, the challenge of the lack of financial resources. So this kind of mix of theological, but also just pragmatic or practical factors that shape the local level of the church. And so I think this study points to the reality of local church life. And I think, as Wilkins himself, the author of this study, kind of pointed out, one of the challenges is that many have the privilege to ignore the immediate environmental problems. Looking beyond the global north, there's a much larger picture of engagement at the local level. There's various edited volumes. So I've got quite a long reference list that I can forward on if you've not got a copy. But there's quite a lot of collections now been doing to kind of highlight the actions in sustainability and climate change, but then also the practical actions in areas like kind of agriculture, nature conservation, food justice movements, water governance, sustainable urbanism, and just each of these kind of emphasizing again that aspect of the different context, the different local context, and how that drives different practices. But often, again, throughout, that social justice and concern for vulnerable populations are common theological drivers for engagement. However, while these collections are rich examples of what is happening, often there's a critique that the lack of a cumulative impact, so it's very kind of bitty, and there was this kind of hope that if the religion, the greening of religion could be a thing, then all these people around the world would be a kind of groundswell of change. And the research seems to indicate that this isn't happening. But despite that, I do want to engage in understanding why we should engage at the local level, and indeed why some of those frustrations about the lack of large-scale change, while they shouldn't be dismissed, they don't tell the whole story about the meaning and practice of creation care at the local level and what it means to us in many ways kind of theologically. So I'm going to just talk a wee bit about some research I did in Scotland, in Edinburgh, where I did some social science research. So I participated in the everyday activities of 3 church congregations who were members of this environmental network called Eco Congregations Scotland. So my research adopted what's called an ethnographic approach. So I spent time in attending 3 churches over the year, different churches every week, kind of attending worship services, making sure to hang around for coffee, being welcomed into the spaces of Bible studies and environmental group meetings, as well as just helping out as a member of a church, holiday clubs, evening meetings, social events. The 3 churches were, one was Presbyterian, one was Church of Scotland, United Reformed, and one was Catholic background. So they were already thinking about environmental issues and engaging in creation care, and they were trying to do something in their local areas to put this concern into action. In different ways, the churches engaged. One of them did gardening projects on the church ground. One of them installed solar panels on a roof. One of them had quite a strong environmental theme for the kind of holiday clubs. And they would integrate creation themes in worship was a common theme of what they did. One of them used the idea of the season of creation, so integrating environmental practice into the liturgical year. And some of the activities were also very externally focused, so kind of trying to engage with their local communities through environmental issues, and starting a community garden in a nearby park rather than on the church grounds. Each of these 3 churches was motivated by a strong claim to social justice and to justice, environmental justice. And that was a particularly strong theme from the Catholic Church background, where it was a peace and justice group who were leading activities. And they did things like they grew vegetables and then donated those to the local food bank, to the local soup kitchen in their church for homeless people. And then the other aspect was, again, that this language of creation care and stewardship is very popular and was commonly adopted, particularly in the Protestant churches, to explain their motivations, with people often preaching from the front about, stewardship of resources, about creation care, and just mentioning that this is why we do it. As I say, the very pragmatic, practical factors, the everyday factors come into reality as well. Many of these initiatives, the people I was interacting with over the kind of 15 months I was there, relied on a small group of committed volunteers who often looked to the leader for the leader of the congregation for support, which was valued when it was there, but led to frustrations and asides when it felt that that support wasn't there. And I think also just the honest, the challenges of volunteers, and do they have the time and resources available to drive engagement? As well as things like financially, can we afford solar panels for a church building? So a challenge was the sustaining volunteers. Many of the actions, relied on a small number of people, and some of the people kind of felt that, well, one of the comments that I received was, it's really hard basically trying to keep going. We did something, we had this whole thing about food and waste, and we were going to do pledges and we were going to kind of follow it, but it's just hard work. And I think one of the challenges with, as many people here will know about sustaining volunteers, is this: you don't get necessarily the feedback from environmental work. So if you're helping in there's a paper that talks about, if you're helping in serving food, if you're helping in a food pantry, there's an immediate feedback loop that you can feel. Whereas in an environmental sense, it can be quite distant, or again, it can feel quite powerless to be doing a little patch of community gardening in light of the big challenges, and when maybe you don't even get a thank you and people don't notice it and things like that. And indeed, during my time with the congregations, one of my volunteers, actually one of my contacts, actually kind of said, I have to stop doing stuff in the church. And she used this she talked about burnout, and she used this phrase of green fatigue and empty batteries. That was really quite deep in terms of just the challenge of committing to keeping going. So I say I don't need to explain the importance of that to anyone here, but I think that there's research showing how this kind of sense of making progress, this sense of feeling valued, are important to sustaining volunteers. And the importance of these social relationships and positive connections are just an important part of the wider mix of avoiding people feeling they're doing futile work. And in the paper I've got, we shouldn't be surprised about these kind of pragmatic factors. Stanley Hauerwas wrote in an essay in 2003, The Servant Community, about how budgets, buildings, parking lots, potluck dinners, heated debates about who should be the next pastor sit alongside theological motivations in just understanding churches. And that's the same for understanding creation care. One of the things through my research, it was very clear that the sense of connection and connecting with others was hugely necessary for maintaining momentum. And so again, at one of my churches, the reason why this kind of an informal fashion exchange, a Saturday evening event where people brought clothes and had a glass of wine, but also it was about kind of sharing clothes, it was about recycling, it was about avoiding clothes going to landfill. But actually the highlight of the event for people, it was the enjoyable social event. It was, they were happy to be doing something right. It's like, this is recycling, isn't it? This is great. But actually it was an enjoyable event where it didn't matter if you left with some new clothes or if you got rid of your old ones. How much waste was diverted from landfill wasn't part of the conversation. It's about this sense of community. And the reflections at the end of the year of some of the people I was speaking to just again highlighted to me how this sense of community really is important. So while one of the churches had done a whole load of events over a year, driving community engagement, renovating energy efficiency systems in their church building, and they were involved in the kind of calculation of how much carbon have we saved by improving the energy efficiency. But actually what was about, it was about bringing people together, getting to know each other. Actually we worked well as a committee, but actually we really just got to know each other, and we've all been in this church for 20 years, and it was just a joy to work with other people. And so I think these kind of quotes show that environmental concerns and benefits aren't necessarily most prominent in people's reflections on events. There's a strong emphasis on this kind of internal community, getting to know the external community, reflections about the importance of the community as both as a motivation for engagement and also strengthened community as an outcome of engagement in environmental issues. And I think this is important, this social aspect, this community aspect is important. And I think it's something we don't often talk about because we find ourselves, so we don't talk about in the environmental context because we focus on the need for creation care and some of the issues that we've been talking about the last few days. but community is recognized elsewhere in wider studies of congregational studies more broadly, and as well as about just participation in political activities as well. So I think there are some studies out that kind of highlight the importance of community and how environmental engagement happens. There's one from 2009 talked about finding an unanticipated component of community building as being important. But it's often kind of overlooked in the kind of religious environmentalism, because we tend to focus on the environment. And I think discussions of what's meant by community can open up a whole other set of discussions, theologically, socially, politically. I will happily get involved in those conversations maybe afterwards over a glass of water or something. There's questions about who's included, who's excluded, who's able to be community, who's got time to be community. And I think community action can often be romanticized as a kind of warm, fuzzy political word that, if the community is involved, then everything's good. But what I think is important here is how studies of the kind of local level engagement of the practice of creation care have often looked at what communities are doing, but not looked at actually the value of community itself. So as I've shown, I think there's a lot of evidence about concerns for justice and the kind of creation care as a practice of justice as a primary motivation for why people get engaged. And I think events over the last few years, last few weeks even, with kind of weird weather patterns, flooding, extreme heat, horrific wildfires, I think these have brought some of the implications of climate change closer to home, and some of the implications of who's being affected by climate change closer to home as well. But many of us still have the privilege to ignore it, the environmental issues. And as I say, environmental engagement is often seen as a white middle-class population. But I think it's increasingly clear that climate change isn't a kind of distant, all these targets that are, we'll reduce emissions by 2050, because that's just far enough away for us to not have to worry about it. But I think it's becoming increasingly clear that climate change isn't a distant issue in time or space. And I think the impacts are coming closer to home. So as I say, I think creation care, the practice of creation care is a practice of social justice. Justice is the most frequently mentioned factor in the literature about why people get engaged. I think justice issues are much wider than environmental issues are perceived to be. And I think, again, there might be tensions in different understandings of justice, but there's connections between environmental justice, climate justice, social justice. They're all part of the same mix. And I think some of you may or may not know, actually, kind of environmental justice as a movement particularly started from faith-based context. There's a report in, I think it was 1987, where the United Churches of Christ did a report about environmental racism and the impact on, racial disparities and who lives where. And it's stuff that we need to open our eyes to, but it's something that the church has been involved in right from the start.
Oh, Dr. Hague, could you wrap it up?
I am,
Okay.
wrapping it up, thanks. Yeah,
thank you.
Sorry. I think, as I say, creation care is a practice of community. It's a space where environmental engagement happens, and it's a context in which environmental engagement is sustained. And the sense of community gives a sense of meaning, I think, to people who participate. So building community is an outcome of engagement. In short, without community, there is no environmental engagement. And then the other thing I want to say is that I think creation care is a practice of hope. I think one thing I find, I was recently at an event where there was it was a kind of Royal Society in London, a big high-level event, this kind of bastion of natural science knowledge. And the conversation turned to hope from the stage. And how do we have hope? And what about morals and kindness? And all these kind of questions about then relationships came up in conversation. And I think there's something about keeping, practicing hope with the small stuff when the big stuff feels overwhelming. And so I think in politics, increasingly, this language of hope is coming in. A friend's local city action group is called Climate Hope Lincoln. And I think you get this language of hope that people need that we in the church have. And so for me, the practice of creation care is quite a lot about the practice at the local level as a practice of hope, as a discipline of hope, even when some of those big challenges can feel overwhelming. And so I think if we practice creation care, just as in closing, as a practice of justice, as a practice of community, and a practice of hope, I think we find that environmental issues then aren't a side issue on the everyday life of the church, but they're core to what church should be about. The pragmatic, practical issues also make a difference, but I think by weaving it all together, the practice of creation care, the practice of being church at the local level, in a world where the environmental challenges can feel very overwhelming, I think understanding creation care and those daily choices as a practice of hope enables us to keep engaging, to keep on keeping on, even when it can feel that actions are small. And for me, they have to be part of the bigger picture of faithfully believing that we can transition to a more sustainable way of living in the world. Thank you.
Wonderful. We'll now have response by James Amadin. James Amadin.
Alice, thank you very much for your paper. If the only thing we took away from your work here is that creation care is your invitation in creation care is that we can practice the discipline of hope, which is a phrase towards the end of your paper, that would be enough. That's a phrase that just needs to be ruminated on, the discipline of hope. But there's much more to affirm and talk about. And I want to respond from my perspective as a practitioner who is in the mix and the messiness of the world that you talk about. Circlewood, my community and organization, is dedicated to accelerating the greening of faith. And I think that's actually happening more than perhaps the research indicates. I think climate change, the reality of what we're facing, it's just harder to ignore. And I think across geographical, ethnic, theological, denominational lines, there's a lot of grassroots work happening that we don't quite see yet. I think it's a movement of the Spirit, and Circlewood's calling within it is to help it go a little bit faster. So what I do is I work with Christian institutions like churches, camps, schools, universities, and with Christian leaders, whether that's pastors, lay leaders, denominational executives, or institutional administrators, to help them work on this. Most of them are Protestant, mostly in the United States, and we're rooted in the Pacific Northwest. We work with people of a range of traditions, from evangelical, very conservative, to mainline and progressive in perspective. And we're also connected to this global movement and global leaders through our Earth Keepers podcast, where we interview creative Earth Keepers from around the globe every 2 weeks. Also work with environmental groups and organizations, and I come to those spaces and places as a follower of Jesus. So I'm learning from these diverse experiences what faith communities are doing and why they're doing it. And I'm also learning why they resist it, the obstacles that stand in the way of change at all of these levels. I'm also learning what happens when communities practice that discipline of hope and find opportunities for transformation that emerge. I want to focus my remarks on one particular obstacle that Alice raises, and it's the obstacle that I believe is most responsible for keeping congregations and other Christian communities from a more ecologically conscious identity, discipleship, and mission, and that's the obstacle of leadership. For good and for ill, leaders play a tremendous role in shaping the identity and direction of communities. And I'm approaching this with a broad definition of leadership, which I will define as the intentional effort to persuade, motivate, and guide others toward an alternative future. And that kind of leadership can come from formal positions of authority or informal ones, and can come from the heart of a community, from its edges, or from the outside. And healthy communities look for and welcome leadership from a variety of positions, perspectives, and places. And theologically, I understand leadership as rooted in our primal vocation to partner with God in tending and keeping the earth. And I think all other vocations flow from that. And I also understand that true leadership is animated by love for God and all that God has made, and that it must be modeled on the leadership of Jesus. So with that kind of broad and yet focused definition, everyone here and every disciple of Jesus should be able to locate themselves. That is because we all share in the primary vocation of earthkeeping, and because leadership is fundamentally communal. So you may or may not consider yourself, quote unquote, a leader, but you are, at least from time to time, exercising leadership in your communities. Leading is incredibly difficult, especially in this era of significant ecological, social, and ecclesial change. And Alice notes 4 challenges in the area of leadership that I want to highlight. The first we'll simply call the ignorance of leaders. This is a lack of knowledge of the biblical story that we've been talking about today. Richard has this great quote from one of his books that I often bring up in my presentations. The vision of God's intent to renew or redeem creation may be the Bible's best kept secret, typically unknown to most church members and even to many clergy, no matter their theological stripe. That's generally been my experience talking to pastors and other theological leaders, especially in the local church context. But I also want to highlight a lack of basic ecological knowledge, what we might call ecological literacy, that we do not, in general, have the skills to read what sometimes we call the book of creation. I think we heard a great example of that this morning in sort of a deep knowledge of one creature that God has made. The second obstacle is the resistance of leaders to the kind of changes we're talking about. Part of that is because leaders, I think, are very tempted to maintain the status quo, that acknowledging your ignorance is uncomfortable. Leaders are supposed to know, they're supposed to guide, they're supposed to be competent. So acknowledging that, whoa, we don't know what to do here. There's information we need, there's skills to develop we don't have. That's threatening. And change is threatening because it can upset the people that you lead. And also, as Alice points out, the status quo for many has come from an implicit and what I call an explicit support of colonial and industrial expansion. Also, a lot of communities view creation care, particularly in our culture, through political and cultural lenses, even in their religious communities. Third, and I think this is huge, she points out the fatigue of leaders. That change is hard work. It's often like rolling a stone up a mountain, and I can speak from experience that can be very lonely and discouraging. And number 4, the distance of leaders. So from her paper, despite what might be said in denominational statements by leaders, research also indicates that churchgoers often feel their local level experiences detached from the denominational statements and actions. That one hurt because I've written such statements and seen them disappear. They sort of, get to the bottom end of a page on the denominational website where they are seldom visited. That said, my own tradition, the Evangelical Covenant Church, has just written a statement to repudiate the doctrine of discovery. But one of my board members, Lenore Three Stars, who's Oglala Lakota, thinks that's a great step, but she wants to see action, not just the statement. I want to suggest some ways to overcome these leadership challenges, but before I do, I want to note a deeper problem that lays behind them. That the majority of our churches and church leaders have been formed for a world that no longer exists. We are living in planetary and ecclesial exile, but we are functioning as if we were still in the promised land. So David Orr, an ecological educator from Goshen College, uses the language of exile to talk about what's happening to our planet. He writes, "We are in the process of evicting ourselves from the only paradise humankind has ever known, what geologists call the Holocene. This 12,000-year age has been abnormally benign, with a relatively stable and warm climate, more or less perfect for the emergence of Homo sapiens. But CO2 levels are now higher than they've been in hundreds of thousands of years, rising still higher each year. We are creating a different and more capricious and hostile planet than the one we've known for thousands of years." In addition, I think we could say we're in ecclesial exile, as the church, at least in our context here, has moved out of the center of Western life and culture. I'm not sure this is such a bad thing. I'm with Phyllis Tickle, who has written a book about the kind of 500-year pattern of reformations that seem to happen. There may be people in the room that might pick that apart a little bit, but I think it's happening. Her claim is that about every 500 years, the empowered structures of institutionalized Christianity, whatever they may be at the time, become an intolerable carapace that must be shattered in order that renewal and new growth may occur. So I do think we're in exile east of Eden, east of Christendom. The planet has changed. We are now in the Anthropocene, a geological age marked by our impacts on the whole planet. And the church, as we have known it, is crumbling. So I don't think the church needs leaders who see creation care as one more ministry to add on that can attract and retain a dwindling pool of congregants. I think the church needs leaders who help us acknowledge the truth of what is happening and why it is happening, and who help us pick up the pieces and imagine a different kind of faith that will help us find a way forward into an alternative future. And that probably sounds daunting to you. It does to me. And it also sounds incredibly exciting, because the good news is that there are so many resources and other people for the journey that lies ahead of us. So I think we can overcome the biblical and ecological ignorance by simply finding the multiplying resources that are available in every tradition now, many more coming out weekly. And these are voices coming from the center, from the edges, and outside of the Christian community. And I have found indigenous and other non-Western voices and perspective particularly helpful to me. There are local ecological resources wherever you live, and people who know, who can lead and guide you to get to know your place better. And there is a form of ignorance that I think we can accept and embrace that are important, that kind of resist the kind of hubris that has gotten us into this mess, and that resist the temptation to fully define the alternative future we're going for. None of us know. Second, I think we can recognize and welcome resistance, because I think it's becoming harder to admit what is happening as change becomes more visible to every single community. And with that in mind, we are free to lead with resolve and compassion, and acknowledge our own resistance to what's happening as well. Third, we can fight fatigue, which is very real, with communal support and recovery of Sabbath. I think this is a key insight of Alice's paper. Without community, there is no environmental engagement. And I would say that's because we are embodied social creatures who are part of the community of creation. And when we embrace that, I think the work of earthkeeping can be energizing and joyful when done together. And I'll say just quickly, when we bring groups out to the Circlewood Forest on Camino Island, right now we have them do projects, and they often, it's trail building, invasive species removal, these kind of things. And inevitably somebody says, can I bring my mower? Can I bring, this? And we tell them, no, we're going to give you simple hand tools, because if you use those machines, you can't hear each other and you can't hear the forest. And it's not that we won't use machinery in the future to do some bigger projects. It's because we recognize that the most important thing that's happening is the connections in those moments between people in congregations who up to that point do not know each other often. And they're working in a beautiful forest alongside each other, making wonderful changes and adaptations to the environment, and they come out just happy, frankly, just happy, and it's hard work. There's something really crucial about Alice's point about community here. And I think that overflows into leadership, because I think leadership is almost never an individual task, and that it is fundamentally communal, and that we need to destroy the myth of the individual heroic leader. Finally, I think we can reduce the distance between leaders and those that we serve. This is another key insight of Alice's paper. It's the power of local action within a multi-level and polycentric system. I think that to me acknowledges we live in an ecological world that's interdependent and interconnected. And I think it's a theological perspective, because my understanding of the gospel is that it's the local particularity of Jesus that makes his life, death, and resurrection universal. So those levels are polyvalent always in creation. And yet with that, all leadership is local. You have to know your people, their motivations, their resistances, their obstacles, their loves, their passions, their fears. We often say at Circlewood, there's 1,000 entry points into this journey. Just find out what theirs is. So in closing, I'll just suggest to you 3 case studies of leadership worth exploring. A biblical one would be Moses, who had to go through the transformative process of learning how to lead a community from the consumptive, destructive, and oppressive regime of Pharaoh towards the caretaking, healing, and liberating reign of God. It's all of Exodus right there for us. A contemporary example would be Greta Thunberg, who took very local action on a Friday that launched a global and prophetic initiative that has swept the planet. And Pope Francis, who Alice brought up, who is leading from the center of the Christian world, but I think it's from his previous experiences living on the edges. Laudato Si is a great work of theological and cultural analysis. Resistance in the Catholic Church is great, particularly in the American context, but he's resolved, and he seems to even sometimes enjoy it. I don't know how he doesn't get fatigued, but I know it's a lot of time in prayer and community. And for someone who could spend all his time distant from the people he served, he makes a remarkable effort to reduce that distance. I'm thinking particularly of his recent trip to Canada, where he visited First Nations people, touched them, held their hands, and experienced firsthand their rejection. So some of them accepted his repentance on behalf of the Catholic Church, particularly with the boarding schools system. Some of them did not. But it takes courage to do that. This from Laudato Si. In closing, many things have to change, but it is we human beings above all who need to change. A great cultural, spiritual, and educational challenge stands before us, and it will demand that we set out on the long path of renewal. And I think we who are privileged to have influence over communities and within communities need to be humble, curious, and courageous leaders willing to embrace the discipline of hope as we guide our people on the long path of renewal. Thanks.
This is our time for questions for both our presenter and our respondent. I invite you to please come up to the microphone and ask your question. And also, I also want to invite those who are online. If you have a question for either a paper presenter or respondent, please feel free to type into the chat your question, and then Nathan Clayton will stand up and read your question for us.
I am so sorry that I missed yesterday, because all of what I'm going to say was probably discussed then. I took a class, online class, about Hildegard of Bingen, who is, the saint that's always heralded. Thank you. Oh, I could have done that. The saint who was always heralded for greening and environmentalism, as well as greening of your soul and keeping alive with Christ. But anyhow, in the midst of that, Matthew Fox was a teacher. I hate to be the liberal here, But Matthew Fox inadvertently said, you know, all religions start with the creation. You had indicated First Nations, but all major religions start with creation and that God created. And it seems to me if we don't truly believe that and let it dominate our whole experience of redemption, the fall and redemption and resurrection, if we don't hit that hard, then everything else caring for the earth becomes devalued. That's not a question, but speak into it.
Thanks. I think that's one of the reasons why I'm keen that we try and almost stop being environmental, you know, and that's maybe not the right way to put it, but it's balancing that as one of the kind of thinking about creation and creation care as one of many things to do, and actually thinking of ways to integrate being well environmentally as the practice of what we do. So the example I gave of you know, growing vegetables on the vegetable patch and using that for work to support homeless people. And there's other examples about things like, you know, kind of solar panels, maybe some of the more technical things. But actually, if a community can say we're going to take this decision for the right reason, because, you know, we're going to, as a church, we're going to invest and take the risk because it's a technology we don't know. But actually, there's also research that shows that actually helps people go, okay, it's not scary, it works, we still have heating. And so there's ways in which we can just practice what it is to be church that are about creation care, but without it being this is creation care week part of things. And I think that's exactly what you're saying. It's like it's fundamental to what it is to be a Christian and to be church. But somehow we've put it off to the side as in addition to everything else we have to do.
It's a long way from the back there to get to the mic in time. Thank you so much, both of you, for what you said. My question was, has your research shown that those themes of community and a discipline of hope has played out like in different contexts beyond the global north? And you did talk about it a little bit, but like at that national level or the international level, and have you seen how that kind of plays out in any way? I just wondered if you could speak to that a little bit.
I think this idea of a discipline of hope or the practice of hope, it's something I've had to convince myself in this balance of the small local stuff where meaning happens, where connection happens, where we get to know each other, where we enjoy a walk out in the forest or, you know, working together. And I think there's something in there about the meaning that is inherent in what it is to be community, and to practice that together. My research has been focused on the global north, and every time I've written a paper, I've had to say, this is why I'm doing Scotland, and yes, there is a bigger world out there. And I'm thankful for the voices of other scholars who are, you know, kind of telling the stories from elsewhere. And I think also from other faiths as well. It's very much, again, the kind of Church of Bangladesh example I touched on. There's stuff there about how they work with people with other faiths in their context, where the realities of climate change are happening daily, and things like that. So I do encourage you to look beyond the global north, because in some ways I feel that's where the stories first came to us. People who were working in elsewhere and kind of saying, okay, this is what we're seeing on the ground. We're seeing the impacts of climate change. And I think we're now in a bit of a reckoning about, oh, it's not distant, it's here as well. And so the challenge will actually be to keep that global view going. I don't know, James, if you want to come in and add to that.
I'll just add that I think there's an opportunity for people like myself who have been steeped in Western culture and trained in Western institutions to flip the historical script. I'll give you in this perspective, and I'll give you one example. In my hometown of Lancaster, New Hampshire, there's a stone in the town commons. On top of the stone is a sculpture of a wolf. And underneath the wolf is a plaque that says, on the 200th anniversary of the founding of the town, in honor of Lancaster's sons and daughters who redeemed the town from the wilderness. And, think about the things that we've been talking about, that perspective of where is evil located and what is our agency to rid the world of evil. And it's the wilderness and the people who lived in that wilderness. I think now when I think about Circlewood and how we have been able to sit at the feet of Native American, Indian, and indigenous leaders who have had an uninterrupted culture of care despite historical atrocities. This is both an act of repentance and learning that is strangely gives me hope.
Please come up. And then Elizabeth, if you have a question, please come back.
So kind of in tandem with hope as being kind of essential for this work on the ground and sustaining and staying encouraged, have you guys seen lament, communal lament, be part of how we kind of emotionally handle this work?
It's not stuff that I've seen practically. I know there's research about climate anxiety. There's quite a lot, particularly younger generations, who are being told everything about this world they're growing into, and it's like, how do I function? But I think, for me, I would say lament is a powerful practice that actually the church can teach wider world. I think too much we just progress to the next thing and we kind of moving forward and we don't have time to stop and reflect. I don't know, James, again, if you...
Yeah, I think lament has to be built into how we lead communities forward. I think if the language of exile is helpful, I think by the rivers of Babylon we wept. And I think, in my own context, the rivers used to be full of salmon and full of the salmon people, and they're not. So I think that was partly what I was trying to get at. And we need, when you have an opportunity to speak and lead, acknowledging that truth before you talk about alternatives, or else it won't work. And the community that's necessary to sustain this long path forward can't be sustained without truth telling, which is what lament is.
Thanks, Alice. I'm wondering if you could speak at all to the relationship between faith communities and civil disobedience as a response to climate change. I'm thinking particularly one of my closest friends who has studied theology, and he's one of the most genuine followers of Jesus I know, was arrested at an XR protest earlier this summer, which my other Christian friends have had all sorts of reactions to. But I'm wondering if any of your research has touched on that.
Yeah, there's a lot going on around that, and I think one of the criticisms of Extinction Rebellion, certainly in the UK, is that some of the faith-based activists are the white middle-class retired people who have never been arrested in their life, are not really going to be affected by being arrested, and actually, so some of the actions that have been taken actually dismiss wider concerns of wider communities. So there's a tension of privilege in being able to be arrested, and saying kind of, come on, and so I think there's there are connections with people, and I think it's people just choosing different paths, and for some people that's fine and that's how they put meaning into it, and for others it's, I'm going to grow a community garden. So I haven't studied it myself, but I know there are people who are engaged in that, and there are people who truly believe that will be what brings about change. But I think it has to be something bigger and something more inclusive.
Oh,
Can I
Richard,
comment on that?
Okay.
Just
sure.
very briefly.
Okay.
So during the civil rights movement, it was very explicit that children were the ones sent to get arrested
Right.
because there weren't the same consequences for workers. So I wonder if that's a relevant issue here with the retired people. Maybe that's a kind of an equivalent. I don't know.
I just find someone working in the kind of community environmental engagement space, and this comes to my questions of who is community, who's represented. It's often the retired. So where I stay, there's a lot of nice retired engineers on their final salaries who've got time and ideas and passion. And so maybe it is that. Maybe it is the kind of it's good to say these are the people who can be arrested and cause chaos in the system.
I just thought of that analogy.
Kind of modern day equivalent, maybe.
And on the question of lament, Israel, not in exile, but in bondage in Egypt, groans in their bondage and cries out to God. And Paul picks up on that, uses the same term. The creation itself is groaning in its bondage. So there's a lament of the rivers and the salmon already. And we need to join them because we have the Spirit. The Spirit is within us groaning also. These inarticulate cries of creation. How can we develop communal rituals of lament for creation care, but also for other issues of justice and so forth, both individual and communal? To me, this is a really important question because my testimony is my faith would not have survived without lament. And that's crucial to my own journey. Yeah. Thank you.
Let me go,
Yeah, I would encourage everybody to, if you feel so inclined, write a lament for something very particular and local. Don't write a lament about climate change. Write a lament about what it's doing to something you love. I think that particularly in local context get their attention. It reminds me of a story by Wendell Berry, who talks about his friend Harlan Hubbard, who was asked by a church in Ohio to paint a picture of the Jordan River. So he said, sure, and came back with a painting of the Ohio River, because that is their sacred river and sacred trust.
We have a question from someone who's watching the symposium online, and Nate Clayton will read the question.
So one of our online participants, whose name is Kermit Hovey, first just also chatted that he would really enjoy being here in person, and this is a theme, this section in particular, that is near to his heart. And this is the question for both of you, if I can read it here on my phone. Could you comment on the complementary value of creation care action focused community building for building congregational community and for building a community of mutually supportive creation cares? Does that make sense? He's thinking of that relationship. So for both of you, I think he's asking about how do you encourage creation carers to mutually support themselves as they're maybe getting to green fatigue, that kind of thing.
I think that's an important part of it. And one of the slightly odd things being a researcher who's trying to connect with 3 congregations over a year was how a couple of people commented to me, it's great that you're here, you're giving us more ideas and you're kind of sharing. And I'm like, okay. And then there's going to be an awkwardness because I was very, one of the challenges of doing social research is how do you leave a community, I'm not committing to these communities ongoing. And that was clear from the start. And so I didn't want my leaving to also be that's another person who's gone. And I do think part of it is the opportunity to bring other people in, the opportunity, the kind of the doing of the work, whether it's planting seeds, whether it's tidying up a community garden. I also talk in the paper a bit more about other ways of doing creation care. It's like kind of actually saying, do we need to use food in youth group games? Or do we actually say, no, as a church, we're not going to do that? And so I think there's ways in which we can encourage each other. And sometimes, where 2 or 3 are gathered, it does just need 2 or 3 are gathered, and then go and have coffee afterwards, or, try and take the opportunity, as well as having the conversations, to just share stories of life, and then connect with other people. There for those, if anyone is feeling lonely in this field, there are lots of networks that I mentioned a few of them, I think, in the paper. There's lots of networks and connections where you can connect with, and I'm sure James would be better connected in the US than I am in terms of pointing people in the right direction.
Yeah, I say if you're trying to do something in this area, it can be hard if you don't have local community support. But I think with the connections we can make worldwide, there are places you can get that. I also think making sure, this was my hint, that Sabbath practices broadly understood as regular rest. That's not just invitation, that's a command, I think. And it's really easy to get burned out. And whatever restorative practices are important to people or helpful to people, don't lose those in activism or doing something hard. And then I think if you're in a position, a leadership kind of role where you see people trying new things, man, encouragement goes a long way. Just amplifying their voice or just saying I'm with you can be a very sustaining kind of practice.
Yeah.
You might have time for one or two more questions, but I'll take one of them if you don't mind my doing so. I'll take presider's privilege. I was struck by the comment that environmental care has been mostly pioneered, or maybe the studies have focused on white middle class. And I was wondering what was being done to inform. Now, I think the indigenous peoples have been very active in that area, but I'm not sure so much about other peoples of color, especially in urban areas. And so I would like to wonder what efforts have been, studies have been done or efforts to inform and educate and rally people of color to creation care. And if anyone knows why there might be reticence to it. I have my own ideas, but it'd be inductive, right, from personal experience and not deductive. But I do think that education would make a big difference by analog, not exactly the same, but a professor of nutrition at Pepperdine University noted that heart disease and diabetes was high among Pacific Islanders. She studied congregations in those areas, even though she herself was not a Pacific Islander. And she informed about, and the theology of self-care was something that drove her study among the churches. And that changed the local culture. And they became much more aware of their bodies and care and good stewardship in an environment where sometimes immigrant cultures are so busy, they don't have time to think about self-care. So I'm just wondering what could be done to reach another segment of the population about creation care.
Yeah. Very good question. Yeah. Yeah. And so I will say, so there, one of the challenges, a lot of the literature, there's this kind of subfield called like religion and ecology. And quite a lot of it has taken surveys, kind of the national surveys that are done every few years, and they've kind of cross-matched. Have you ticked the box somewhere saying you go to church or not, and do you pray regularly? So this kind of measure of how religious are you, and they've taken another set of questions about environmental stuff, and often what's happened is it's become the very conservative fundamentalist churches, which have the high indicators of let's say this language of religiosity, with the yes or no, I don't do environmental action. And so some of the kind of academic studies have focused on the more fundamentalist aspect of the church, which has, historically been quite a lot of the white evangelical church. And so the pushback over the last, I would say, 10, 15 years has been to try and say, we need more stories to find out what's going on. And we need to look beyond these surveys and actually find what's going on. So there's a book I've recommended by an author called Amanda Baugh, who did this study on faith in place. I think there's lots of, certainly in the UK situation, there's lots of ground up activism on things like helping people getting comfortable outside hiking in nature. And it's so there's like I think it's called Black Hikers, I think is one of the groups. There's also people who have pointed out that some of these political structures beautifully mirror the kind of, again, the white global north structures of governance and aren't so open to faith groups that don't follow that structure. So I've got some colleagues I know in Manchester who've been looking at how Muslim faith communities are engaging, and they're finding that these kind of governance structures are actually a block because the governance structures don't know who to talk to in the Muslim community because there's not a national representative in the way that there might be in a Christian community. So from my experience, there are a lot of people, so there's a lot of activity going on, and it needs to be given voice and it needs to be seen.
I don't know the research aspect of it, but I can give some examples that, Circle, one of the things we do through our media is try to highlight practitioners. I think of Soul Fire Farm in New York, run by and for African-American community, the Black Birder Association, kind of those sort of grassroots groups that are about access to green spaces. Writers like Bell Hooks, who have been helpful to me, writing about the intersection of race and environment. I think the obstacles that I see, and there are more, the structural racism in environmental movements, in the conservation movement, that's becoming more and more documented, and sometimes by journalists more than researchers, but that's there. I think the economic structures that we have in place, particularly of taking the abuses of free market capitalism, don't take the planet into account. So what you end up with is a bunch of people living beyond the planet's means, and a bunch of people who don't have enough. And there's a British economist named Kate Raworth who's coined the phrase donut economics, where if you picture a donut, people inside the donut hole don't have enough and don't have a voice. People outside have too much and too much influence, and both are stressing the planet. And we need to have an economic system that pulls down and up. And then I just think the way we've constructed our built environment in terms of proximity to green spaces, often there's an incredible lack of access for non-white communities.
I'm aware that we're almost 10 minutes past our time. So last question.
No, I'm going to just mention a resource.
Oh, okay, yeah. please,
You
thank
might look up Green the Church.
Okay, Green.
It's a primarily African-American environmental eco-justice Christian movement.
Green the Church. Thank you very much. All right, can we give a hand to our presenter? Thank you.